There's something deeply unsettling about stories that start as a dream. A couple walks away from everything they've built, careers, homes, stability, to chase a different kind of life, one that promises freedom, adventure, a chance to finally live on their own terms. For Lynette Hooker and her husband Brian Hooker, that dream was the open water, a sailboat they spent years working toward, a life spent chasing the horizon, documenting their journey, building something new together. It's the kind of story we've seen before, because not so long ago, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie set out on a similar path. Different setting, but the same idea. Sell everything, start over, capture the dream as it unfolds. So a couple isolates themselves, whether it's on the road in a van or out on the water in a sailboat. They leave behind friends, family, and the structures that normally surround them. What's left is just the two of them, and whatever dynamics existed between them. In both of these cases, Lynette Hooker and Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito, something beneath the surface didn't match what was being shown to the world. There were cracks, tension, moments that suggested the relationship wasn't as carefree as it appeared. And in both cases, the woman disappeared and the man returned to civilization without her, the only person left to tell the story of what happened. When Lynette Hooker vanished in the Bahamas in April of 2026, her husband Brian Hooker was the one who told the story of what happened. He said she fell overboard from their dinghy during rough conditions, and despite his efforts, he couldn't reach her. A sad accident. Two long-married people who were tragically separated by unforeseen circumstances. A husband left behind to lose sleep and shed tears as the search for his wife produced no results. But then, things began to come out. Family members expressed doubts, police reports emerged. The details of what happened in that dinghy changed and shifted. The probability of what allegedly happened started to get lower and lower.
What you can't explain, is coming back again. I can see it now, I can see it now. What you can't explain, coming back again.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another coffee and crime time. As you know from the intro, we are talking about 55-year-old Lynette Hooker, who allegedly fell into the waters of the Bahamas and vanished on April 4th, 2026. So I've been following this case since day one. I really did try to give Lynette's husband Brian the benefit of the doubt. Then the details of the relationship came out, and that was one thing, right? People can have a rocky relationship and still not kill each other. I totally am open-minded to that. But it was when I really started to examine Brian's version of events, the place he claims Lynette fell off the boat, the little details that really matter when it comes to context, the facts that you can't deny or bend to fit a narrative, like wind and tide and just in general, everything Brian said. His facts don't match up with any actual reality facts. And that's when it really hit me that this case was giving me echoes of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, and I don't like it at all. I don't like it. So we have a lot to talk about today, but before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark. I want to thank today's sponsor, Surfshark. And I know when people hear Surfshark, they might immediately think of one thing, but what I really like about Surfshark is that it's not just one tool, it's more like a whole digital security setup that helps you feel a little less exposed online, which, considering how much of our lives are online now, is honestly kind of necessary. So yes, with Surfshark, you have tons of VPN options, but you have a whole toolbox full of other tools that you can use. And one feature I really like is Surfshark Alert, which can let you know if your personal information appears in leaked databases, because sometimes you don't know your email, passwords, or personal details have been compromised until something weird or bad happens. And by then, you're already in damage control mode, and who knows what kind of damage you're trying to fix. Surfshark Alert helps you get ahead of that so you can change logins before your accounts get taken over. They also have an email scam checker, which I love. I think it's so useful because scam emails are getting way too out of hand. They're getting also way too convincing. So you can check an email in your inbox to see if it may be a scam or a phishing attempt. I am really into this and I use it all the time. I get tons of weird emails, and I always tell people when they send me emails and they're trying to show me things, like, I'm not going to click on links. I don't click on any external links that I get, because I'm getting so many emails and so many links, and I'm just super paranoid about it. The email scam checker is awesome because sometimes even the most internet savvy person gets that one email where you're like, wait, is this real? Or am I about to ruin my entire life by clicking this? Another feature that Surfshark has that I love is alternative ID and alternative number. So instead of handing over your real name, real email, or real phone number to every random website that asks for it, Surfshark can help you use generated information on sites you don't fully trust. And this is great, even if it's just cutting down on the random texts you get from some weird company that asked you to put your phone number in so that you could get a discount. And then all of a sudden every day, this company's texting you, and that's annoying. So that's going to mean less spam, less unwanted attention, and less of your real information floating around in places it does not need to be. Surfshark also has Clean Web, which automatically blocks known malicious websites, phishing methods, and other online threats, plus Surfshark Search, which gives you private search results without ads or trackers following you around like a Victorian ghost with Wi-Fi. And one subscription lets you use Surfshark on an unlimited number of devices, which is great if you're like me and you have a phone, a laptop, a tablet, several other devices that are all judging you and tracking you at the same time. All these devices where certain, spam or phishing attempts can reach you. And if you have parents who are of the, older generation, they aren't as tech savvy, and they are the ones that are being targeted with a lot of these scams and things, because the people scamming them or trying to scam them know that they're not, kind of used to technology because they didn't grow up with it. So you can have your mom's stuff covered, your dad's, your kids, because they're also vulnerable to these kind of things. And every device you own, Surfshark has unlimited devices that they'll cover for you. Surfshark also works across all major platforms. That includes your kids' gaming systems, and they also offer 24/7 live customer support and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Surfshark has now reached coverage in 100 countries, and they are the only VPN to do that. But again, for me, the big selling point is Surfshark gives you a lot of tools to help protect your digital life in one place. So go to surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe and use code stephanieharlowe at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark. Again, that's surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe and use code stephanieharlowe to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Thank you so much to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. And now let's dive in. Okay, so remember it was August of 2022 when Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie began documenting their van life experience driving cross-country in their handcrafted 2012 Ford Transit Connect. They said that they wanted to downsize their lives and travel full-time. 5 years ago, Lynette and Brian Hooker sold their home in Michigan, bought a camper, and started preparing for their retirement dream of living on a sailboat. So apparently I looked into this, and there's people who want to not just live on a sailboat, but they want to constantly be sailing around. So they're living on a sailboat, but they're not like docked. They are always sailing from place to place, and they're called liveaboards. As I found out, this is a full community of people. It's not super common, as in, hundreds of thousands of people aren't doing it a year, but it's common enough to have a very real and flourishing subculture. And apparently for Brian and Lynette, sailing was already something the married couple of 20 plus years loved to do together. And for Lynette, being on the water was her happy place. So Lynette and Brian drove around the country. They were looking for their perfect sailboat, and they finally found it in Texas in 2022. Now, like Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, Lynette and Brian Hooker chronicled this new chapter of their lives on their YouTube channel, The Sailing Hookers.
Closing day in Rockport, Texas. After several years of driving around the country looking for our perfect sailboat, we finally found her in Texas. We bought a Morgan 461. She's a 1980 charter boat from the Virgin Islands. She was a little rough on the edges. The decks needed to be redone, but we knew we were up for the task. Brian climbs the mast to install lazy jacks for our safety.
Day one, we just left Rockport, Texas.
John Waters, a friend of Lynette and Brian's, said he would meet the couple at an oyster bar in Panama City Beach, Florida in 2023. And at that time, Lynette told him that they were on a journey to sail around the Gulf of Mexico. He said, quote, their new lifestyle was this boat that they picked up in Texas. They spent a year working on it, end quote. The sailboat would ultimately be named Soulmate. And Brian and Lynette did in fact set out on a journey. They spent some time in New Orleans in 2023, and on November 29th, a picture posted to their Instagram account was captioned, Chasing Summer, and the words on the screen read, Goodbye NOLA. So I think the meaning of Chasing Summer meant that they were leaving New Orleans and they were heading further south where the temperatures would remain warmer, because NOLA does get a bit cooler in late fall and winter. It's not that far south where they're not going to have some like dropping temperatures. And I think Lynette and Brian just wanted to be in a place where it was always summer. So on December 3rd, a post on their Instagram showed they were heading to Florida. A few days later, they were in Pensacola, and from there they went to St. Pete, Tampa, and Fort Myers Beach, where they became scuba certified. So on Instagram, there is a pretty substantial gap in posts between January of 2024 and January of 2025, and I think I know why that is. I have my speculations, but we'll talk about that later. On January 25th, 2025, Brian and Lynette's Instagram showed that they were heading south, and the next day they were in Key West, Florida. So it looks like they may have hung out in Key West for a while, and by June they were in Jacksonville, Florida. Then in early February of 2026, Brian and Lynette were visiting Peanut Island, a small man-made island only accessible by water just off the coast of West Palm Beach, Florida. This was on February 7th, and by February 22nd, Lynette and Brian Hooker had left U.S. waters and ended up in the Bahamas. From then on, until Lynette's disappearance in April, they seemed to hang around the same area, the Sea of Abaco, the Abaco Island chain. On April 2nd, Lynette and Brian were filling their scuba tanks at Great Guana Key, and on April 3rd, the last post was captioned, Not going anywhere for a while. That brings us to April 4th, a Saturday, the Saturday before Easter Sunday, and the night Lynette Hooker allegedly fell off a dinghy. So this is an 8-foot hard bottom motorized dinghy. We see it a lot on their Instagram and YouTube videos. Lynette and Brian would use the dinghy to get from their sailboat to other places because most cruising sailboats have to anchor further away from land. They're too big, or especially in this area of the Bahamas, it's very shallow in a lot of places. So the dinghy would be their connection to the shore. They would use their dinghy to go to restaurants, bars, to get groceries, to explore smaller islands and beaches, etc. Lynette and Brian had been having drinks at the Abaco Inn in Hopetown that night, and their sailboat was anchored at the eastern edge of Aunt Pat's Bay. Hopetown is the main village of Elbow Key, a 5-mile-long key in the Abaco Islands, and Aunt Pat's Bay is on Elbow Key, roughly 2.5 miles away from Hopetown and the Abaco Inn. So at some point between leaving Hopetown in the dinghy and going to the sailboat, Lynette fell over with the boat keys, which caused the dinghy to lose power, and then a strong current reportedly carried her away, and Brian lost sight of her. Brian then paddled the dinghy to the shore with only one oar, apparently, because Lynette had the key, so the engine wouldn't work. And he arrived at the Marsh Harbor boatyard around 4 a.m. the next day, where he informed someone about what had happened to his wife, and the police were called. The police said in a statement, quote, "He lost sight of her. He then paddled the vessel to shore." End quote. Bahamian authorities and local fire and rescue crews began to search for Lynette at approximately 4:30 a.m. That's what we initially heard, but it sounds like it was about an hour later. A later media report stated that Brian Hooker told the officials that he last saw his wife swimming towards the shore. So while the media and general public were not getting many more details than this initial and pretty simple series of events, Brian Hooker was corresponding with friends and family members, providing them with more details, which would eventually be his downfall. So Brian had told the authorities he'd last seen Lynette swimming towards the shore, but he told his friend something a bit different, that he had last seen Lynette swimming towards their sailboat, which would have made more sense. We'll talk about that in a second. So over the weekend that Lynette went missing, a man named Daniel Danforth noticed that Brian Hooker had liked a comment on a post that Daniel's wife had shared about boating, and Daniel said that he had met Brian and Lynette 3 years prior while they were all sailing in the New Orleans area, and when he saw Brian like the comment, it reminded him of the Hookers, and then he started seeing media reports about a woman missing the Bahamas. So he sent a Facebook message to Brian Hooker on the evening of Monday, April 6th, and he said, quote, "Did we just see y'all on the news? ABC World News said Lynette fell off the boat," end quote. Brian Hooker replied, quote, "Yes, brother, I'm afraid so. Off the dinghy in some choppy seas on the way back to the sailboat. The wind blew me away from her and she swam towards the sailboat and we lost sight of each other pretty quickly as it was just about sundown. I drifted and tried to paddle with one oar for the next 7 hours until I washed up behind the shore the next island over and was able to finally get some help. We are all still searching. A lot is going on right now, but thank you for checking on us. Being on the news is a huge burden, and I just had my first ever news organization call me a few minutes ago." End quote. Daniel Danforth asked Brian if he had a place to stay on the island or if he was staying on the sailboat, and Brian replied, quote, "I got the boat back to Marsh Harbor yesterday after the fire department brought me back my dinghy. I'm on a mooring ball at a place called Conch Inn, staying on the boat," end quote. As it turned out, Lynette and Brian had a mooring ball that they rented at the Conch Inn, so it was basically like a long-term sort of rental, so they could always dock the soulmate on that mooring ball at the Conch Inn, which is across from Elbow Key, so not the same kind of island. So Daniel Danforth had some issues with this version of Brian's story. First, he thought it was odd in general that Brian was on Facebook liking comments on posts while Lynette was allegedly missing, lost at sea. Daniel Danforth said, quote, "You know, my wife's missing. Facebook's the last thing I'm worried about. You're going to find me on the water riding around," end quote. Danforth also said he was concerned that Brian had moved the sailboat from Elbow Key shortly after Lynette went missing, and he felt that Brian's messages to him about Lynette's disappearance didn't really line up with the emerging media reports. Danforth also mentioned that he and his wife had sailed with Lynette and Brian plenty of times, and Lynette and Brian always had their phones with them. They were frequently posting videos and pictures on social media, so he wanted to know why Brian didn't have his phone with him that night or why it wasn't working. Now, reportedly, Brian did have his cell phone with him on the dinghy that night, but it didn't work because it was only able to make calls on Wi-Fi. Okay, so Brian also sent friends some pictures, screenshots from a GPS app called Navionics that boaters use to navigate. And so these 3 screenshots have areas that are marked supposedly by Brian, and they're labeled with where the sailboat was anchored, where Lynette fell off the dinghy, and then a red line labeled Brian's dinghy route, which supposedly is the path that Brian's dinghy took to Marsh Harbor after Lynette fell off the dinghy. And also it kind of shows the path of them leaving the Abaco Inn. It shows them leaving Elbow Key and like where they were going, and then when Lynette fell off, and then how he went on to Marsh Harbor. So the only thing we can really know for sure about these screenshots and what was marked on them by Brian is where the soulmate was anchored, which is at Ampats Bay. We know that because the boat was seen there by many people. You'll see many people took pictures, many people took videos, so we know it was there. But as far as the route that Brian took, when he left Elbow Key and went towards Marsh Harbor and where Lynette fell off, those things are just going on his word. And when I saw these screenshots, this is where things started to really sharpen in my mind, because the way it's explained, you would think that Brian and Lynette were out in the open ocean and bad weather kicked up and these huge currents and waves appeared, and maybe then the story makes some sense. Not really, but it's possible, I guess. But that's not actually the kind of terrain that we're dealing with here. So you know I love Google Earth. I go to Google Earth. Let's head over there and see what we can see. So here I have a screenshot of Elbow Key. The blue mark is the Abaco Inn, where Brian and Lynette had a dinner or had drinks. The orange mark is where Brian claims Lynette fell out of the dinghy, and the yellow mark is where he claims the sailboat was anchored. I'm going to zoom out a bit so you can see all those same place marks, but also see the red place mark over to the left, which is the Marsh Harbor boatyard where Brian claims his dinghy washed up 7 hours after Lynette went into the water. Now, let me give you a little information about this specific area of water because it's clearly not open ocean. It's more like a wide, shallow inland sea dotted with sandbanks and small keys, and it is pretty shallow, between 6 to 15 feet deep, with sudden, even more shallow spots in areas of shifting sand, as you can see on Brian's screenshots. This is also a high-traffic boating area, which is constantly used by sailboats, dinghies, ferries, local fishing boats, because it connects Elbow Key to Marsh Harbor, a main hub that has marinas, boatyards, and an airport. So Elbow Key is more like the party place. It's got bars and restaurants, but Marsh Harbor is where the boatyards and marinas, the airport, it's a well-traveled, well-known area that Brian and Lynette were traveling in the dinghy that night. Not in the least remote, not in the least rarely used. It is the path that boaters use to get between these two areas, Marsh Harbor and Elbow Key, and also other areas that are kind of in the same general vicinity, because they don't want to go out into the rougher Atlantic where there would be like big swells and rougher waters. So when the weather is good, this is a pretty calm area. That's the whole point. That's why boats are anchored there and docked there. The water is relatively smooth. It's easy cruising. Now, when the conditions are windy, you can get some short, choppy waves, enough to jostle a small dinghy. And we can see that Brian and Lynette's dinghy was quite small, and it would make handling the dinghy a bit more difficult if the water was rough. But as it turns out, the water wasn't rough that night, okay? We have video footage to prove it. There's a security camera from, I believe it was Lubber's Quarters, which is kind of between Elbow Key and Marsh Harbor, and it's looking out towards Elbow Key, the security camera, and it's not rough that night. It's just not. It's not. It's very easy. It's pretty flat. There's like a little wind you can see, but nothing that is going to create waves that Brian claims stole Lynette from the dinghy, okay? So the navionics system that Brian was using, it does a lot of things, including showing where it's safe to take your boat by factoring in all sorts of things and then displaying the risk level, and then also displaying the safest path to take. So the light colors, like the tan and light blue, indicate very shallow areas where there's risk of grounding the boat or the dinghy. More boat, less dinghy, because a dinghy is not as big, right? And it's not going to need as deep water to travel in. Now, darker blue usually indicates deeper water. You can even set a safety depth in the Navionics GPS app. So if your particular vehicle needs 5 feet of depth, everything that's more shallow, then that will be highlighted. So if you're on the sailboat, the Soulmate, you're going to need more depth, so you can set it for that vehicle. And then if you're in the dinghy, you're going to need less depth. So you can set it and tell the app that you're in the dinghy. So the dinghy would need a comfortable depth of about 3 to 4 feet. So a dotted magenta line usually means a safer path to take on the app. And according to the red mark that Brian has made on this map, it looks like that's the route they were following. But apparently it also put Lynette falling out in a shallower area of water. And that's what these pictures show us. The place where Brian says Lynette fell out is not deep at all. So now maybe the conditions were really bad, very windy, the water very choppy. They weren't. The conditions were not like that. Apparently, at that time on that night, like I said, the conditions in Hopetown were that it was, kind of windy, there was some rain, etc., but nothing crazy. But even if the conditions in Hopetown on the Atlantic side were, 15 to 20 knots with gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour and rain showers, even if it was pretty bad over there, once again, the impact in these more shallow waters where Brian and Lynette were traveling in the dinghy, they would have been significantly less than the open sea. And this area that Lynette and Brian were traveling in the dinghy, allegedly, because I don't believe Lynette ever went anywhere with Brian in the dinghy, at least not the route that he says he took. That area that they were traveling in is protected by sandbanks and keys. It's not fully exposed to open ocean, which is why it's well traveled by boats, which is why boats feel comfortable anchoring and docking there. So the conditions being rough, even if they were, which they weren't, that still does not explain everything. First of all, why was Lynette wearing the kill switch fob? So that's the cord that if pulled, the engine will shut off so that the driver and the dinghy don't get too separated. And in all the videos I've seen posted on the Hookers Instagram and YouTube, it's always Brian who's driving. And even Lynette's own daughter said Brian always drove, Lynette never drove. And it's Brian who has the fob attached to him, or at least it's like in the vicinity.
Success.
All right, got the grub.
Got groceries.
Delivery. It's the way of life, man.
And if Lynette fell off the dinghy at the place Brian indicated, why would she start swimming towards the sailboat? Why would she start swimming towards the land, right? Because we're getting different versions of events from Brian. In some versions, she's swimming towards the shore. In some versions, she's swimming towards the soulmate, the sailboat. Wouldn't she swim towards the dinghy? Right? Wouldn't she, if she just fell off the dinghy, she didn't fly like 100 yards. If she just fell into the water and bounced into the water, as you'll hear him say, wouldn't she be closer to the dinghy than she would be to the sailboat or the shore? And okay, let's go along with Brian's version of events. It's the seas are angry and they're chopping in 4-foot waves and it's windy. All right, so if the winds and or the current were pushing Lynette the opposite way, wouldn't they also push the dinghy that way? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. Now, there was also a question for a while of whether or not Lynette was wearing a life jacket. Once again, for many reasons, based on their videos, I don't believe she was, because neither of them ever were when they were in the dinghy. But it has since been confirmed that she was not wearing a life jacket. In fact, the life jackets were still in the dinghy. Now, to the red line on the image labeled Brian's dinghy route. This red line, I assume, is the route, and it shows a direct crossing over shifting sand areas. These areas are marked with depths as low as 3 to 6 feet on the Navionics map. So for Brian's dinghy to have traveled 4 miles from the point where Lynette allegedly fell off to the Marsh Harbor boat yards, 8 hours later, a few things would need to be true. Wind direction would have had to have been pretty consistent that whole time, and that route shows that the dinghy would have crossed shifting sand zones, which realistically may have caused a drifting dinghy to slow down, catch bottom, or veer off course. To be completely clear to me, this whole thing doesn't make any sense, and I'm not the only one who feels that way. Ken, the bartender who served Lynette and Brian at the Abaco Inn that night, also reported that something doesn't make sense. Ken said, quote, "It's weird from him to be going from here to there, then ending up in Marsh Harbor and nobody sees the lady. It's weird. What catches my eye is they left here at 7:30, her going going missing supposedly happened right after they left here, and he didn't make it over there until 4 a.m., something like that, in 25-mile-per-hour winds. It's only 4 miles that way. It shouldn't have taken 8 to 10 hours to get there. Even if he was only floating, it should have been a much quicker time, end quote. Absolutely, this is correct. And here's a few things. As it turns out, from the receipts and things, and from, I believe, another bartender at the Abaco Inn, Lynette and Brian may have left earlier. Brian had initially claimed that they'd left the Abaco Inn and left Hopetown around 7:30 p.m. But as it turns out, Lynette and Brian Hooker appear to have left a lot earlier than Brian claimed. And the bartender said, yeah, I served them their last drinks at I think between 6 and 6:30. And the bartender said that he believed they left around 6:30. So that night that Brian and Lynette were at the Abaco Inn, there was another guy there. I mean, there was plenty of people there because it's a vacation spot. But there was another guy there, and he's on vacation, and he took this picture to send to his mother and show her the beautiful beach area he was at. And in this picture, we can see Brian and Lynette sitting by the pool at the Abaco Inn where they were having drinks. This picture was taken at 6:38 p.m. According to Lynette's daughter and Lynette's daughter's boyfriend, who were shown surveillance video of Lynette and Brian leaving the Abaco Inn. This picture was taken just a few minutes before Lynette and Brian left, heading back to their dinghy to go back to the sailboat, which means they left an entire hour before Brian said they left, which means it would not have been dark and the wind conditions would have been different and it would not have been dark. So when Brian's telling all of these people, oh, yeah, it was dark, I couldn't see her, you're going to hear directly from him in a minute. But when he's telling people she fell off the boat and it was dark and I couldn't see her, that would have been impossible. Because that means that when Lynette fell off the boat, if she did, or off the dinghy, it wouldn't have really been dark. At the most, it would have been getting dark. It would have been like dusk. But not even, not even that. It would have been pretty much broad daylight. Now, additionally, there's another picture taken at the Abaco Inn the night Brian and Lynette were there. A couple is taking a picture together, and in the background, you can see Lynette standing there like she's closer to the water. She's taking a selfie. Now, Lynette in this picture is wearing the same thing that she's wearing in the picture where her and Brian are sitting by the pool. She's wearing her black bathing suit, a green cover-up. It's kind of like a teal cover-up. She has on a greenish-blue headscarf kind of thing. She also has a pink Apple Watch on her wrist. Now, Ashley Banfield, who's done a lot of great reporting on this case, she points out that in this picture, you can see that the water does look rough and choppy, and that's true because at this point, Lynette was standing on the east side of Elbow Key, the Atlantic Ocean side, where you'll often see larger ocean swells, much rougher water, especially when easterly winds are blowing. But the west side, the Sea of Abaco side, is protected from the Atlantic by Elbow Key itself. So it doesn't mean it's always flat, and strong winds can create some rough waters, but it generally lacks the long, powerful ocean swells seen on the Atlantic side, and this is why dinghies travel back and forth every evening, and that's why sailboats anchor on the west side. I've said this a million times. There's no crazy 4-foot waves happening that night in the Sea of Abaco. That's all I'll say. Security video from homes located in that area have shown that the water on the west side of Elbow Key the night Lynette went missing in the Sea of Abaco, where Brian says they were traveling in their dinghy, it was perfectly flat and perfectly calm. But more importantly, at this point, Lynette is wearing her Apple Watch on the night she went missing. Okay? And according to Brian Hooker, the only place they went after leaving the Abaco Inn was into the dinghy, and then Lynette randomly bounced out, and she was lost to him forever. So how did Lynette's Apple Watch end up where it was eventually found by the Royal Bahamian Police? On the Soulmate, the sailboat that Brian claims they never made it back to, right? So Brian says, we had some drinks at the Abaco Inn. Then we left at 7:30. And then we got in the dinghy, and we were taking the dinghy back to the sailboat in Ampats Bay, which is still on Elbow Key, but like 2 miles down. So if you're facing, I keep going this way, but if you're facing Marsh Harbor, if I'm facing Marsh Harbor and this is the Abaco Inn, the Soulmate would be in Ampats Bay, which would be this way. So they'd have to just kind of leave, go out this way, travel, a few miles down in the dinghy, and there's the sailboat. Lynette's wearing her Apple Watch in the picture that we see her in at the Abaco Inn, taking a selfie. Okay, thank God those people, found the picture. And Ashley Banfield has a lot to do with this. She's been calling people to send in their photos from that night if they were at the Abaco Inn or if they were at Aunt Pat's Bay so they could show pictures of the soulmate and stuff. And these people sent the picture in. Lynette's wearing her Apple Watch, but it's not with her body when she goes missing. It's on the soulmate. The sailboat that Brian says they never made it back to, they were on their way to going back to when Lynette just bounced off into the water. Okay, so on April 7th, Brian spoke to some friends of his and Lynette's, Marnie and Blaine Stevenson, and we will talk about them again later, but they voted together and they've known each other for several years. So the Stevensons and the Hookers, like I said, a very tight community, these liveaboards. They stay very close and they keep in contact. So in an almost 40-minute phone conversation that the Stevensons recorded, because they knew Brian was shady, Brian talked to them about what had happened to Lynette.
Hopetown Volunteer Fire Department. The Coast Guard was searching yesterday. I didn't get a straight answer if they were out today. Tomorrow is our last good weather day. Some of my family's here on the island, and I'm dealing with the others, over the phone and things like that. We're all fucked up. Everybody's fucked up, really. I mean, she was the best part of this relationship, frankly, and I'm keeping up the faith is what I have, but it's incredible. I mean, like in the literal sense,
I saw it on Facebook, and it never even crossed my mind that it could have been you guys. And then Blaine just asked me, he's like, have you heard from them?
No, we are. She basically just bounced off the dinghy in the middle of a little blow, like 20-some knot winds that popped up, and on a half-mile maybe trip back to the...
Once again, looking at the dinghy, how small it was, how low the sides were. If choppy water popped up, I suppose it is possible that Lynette could have been thrown in the air and bounced off the dinghy into the water, but there were no choppy waters. There were no 2 to 4 foot waves.
Single thing failed. Every single thing. We weren't wearing life jackets. It was sundown, and the sun set like basically 10 minutes after she fell over. Dinghy key over with her because it wasn't clipped to anything or anybody, and she had the spare dinghy key in her dry bag, which was with her.
Okay, so now we know and find out that there was a spare dinghy key, but that was in Lynette's dry bag, which was with her. So it could have been a book bag type thing or maybe even a crossbody bag, but I'm confused about Brian saying Lynette had the dinghy key, which wasn't clipped onto anything or anybody. I looked into it, and on a small motorized dinghy like this one, you would have typically the ignition key, which is a traditional metal key, and it's not attached to anything you wear. Then you'll also have the kill switch lanyard, the engine safety cord, which is a clip and cord attached to the engine kill switch and to the operator's like shorts or wrist. So now I'm hearing that Lynette was attached to the engine kill switch and she had both keys to the dinghy on her person when she fell off. That's a lot to go wrong. And it doesn't seem like something that would be logical for anyone to do, especially if they'd been out boating for as long as Lynette and Brian Hooker had been.
So she had her dry bag with her.
I got the oars unshipped. Yeah, it was inflated. Inflated because it was folded, but...
The dry bag was inflated? Okay, interesting.
The wind blew us apart so fast that I think she tried to swim back to the sailboat, back to our sailboat, which was probably, 1,000 yards or something. But the waves were 3 foot, and I was trying to ship the oars, and one of the pins on the oars broke, and that fucker dropped over the side. And I was yelling for her the whole time, and I yelled to her that I lost an oar, and I threw the anchor out and anchored the dinghy, and just, yeah, I yelled. I couldn't see her anymore. It was the moon had not risen yet.
The waves were 3 feet, Brian thinks. He also thinks she was trying to swim back to the sailboat. He tried to row towards her, but a pin on the oar broke, and then it fell over the side. So now he only has 1 oar. Brian says he was yelling out to Lynette the whole time. He yelled to her that he'd lost one of the oars, and then he dropped anchor. Now, I'm not sure why he wouldn't drop anchor first to give Lynette a stable and closer target to swim towards, but I admittedly know nothing about boating, so maybe it's not as easy as it sounds to just like pick up the anchor, which is at the bottom of the boat, like in your way, and right there, because it's a dinghy. It's like small, 8 feet. It's a dinghy. It's right there. Maybe it's not as easy as it sounds. Just pick up the anchor and throw it out. What do I know? But Brian does say he threw the anchor out and then anchored the dinghy. So maybe it was actually that easy to just do that the whole time. Why'd you wait so long to do it? But anyways, Brian then says he yelled for Lynette some more, but he couldn't see her because by now it's dark. But could you hear her swimming? If she was swimming the last time you saw her, she would be able to hear you yelling for her, and then she'd be able to yell back. Did the weather and water conditions really become that bad within the blink of an eye, where the waves are 3 feet high and it's blowing so hard that you can't hear her and she can't hear you? No. Based on all the available information, the conditions in the Abaco Sea, or the Sea of Abaco, were not that bad. And not really bad at all. There was definitely not an incident where Lynette would have fallen off and Brian was like, Lynette, and she can't hear him. Or she's calling to him and he can't hear her. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. If you've been dinghying in the Sea of Abaco, let me know. If any of you have more experience with this, let me know. I know you will anyways.
And the waves were doing their thing. And, I saw her, I think, twice. I threw her a flotation cushion that we used to sit on the dinghy, right after she went in. But I couldn't tell if she got it or not. We've been looking for the cushion too, the search and rescue teams.
Okay, Brian says he saw her twice after Lynette went over, and he threw her a flotation cushion, but he doesn't know if she got it. Remember, there's 2 life vests, right, in the dinghy, 2 of them. He throws her this like flat foam cushion thing, so he doesn't know if she got it. He says search and rescue has been looking for it. Well, on April 7th, which is the same day this call took place, allegedly, Brian called Lynette's daughter, Carly, and left this voicemail.
So, honey, I just got a call from Hopetown Search and Rescue, and they have found a flotation device that I threw to Mom when she fell overboard, and they haven't found her yet, but they can now focus all of their efforts in a smaller area.
Carly says this voicemail happened on the evening of April 7th, but we don't have a specific timestamp for the call at this time. Blaine Stevenson said that Brian was talking to him at 10 p.m. that night. So if that's true, I would say it's likely that Brian called Carly before 10 and said they'd found the flotation cushion. And afterwards, when he's talking to the Stevensons, he's saying the opposite. But I would also like to point out that the day after Lynette went missing, April 5th, he went out on a boat with like search and rescue, and they spotted this foam. It's not inflatable. It's like a foam cushion thing, like a flotation thing, but it's not inflatable. They saw it on Marsh Harbor, like on the shore. And they were like, oh, do you think that's what it is? And Brian was like, yeah. And yeah, they didn't go back to get it for 2 days, so they didn't get it to the 7th. But I guarantee you, they'd already let him know earlier in the day that they found it, and he'd already spotted it on the shore and told the search and rescue boat people, yeah, I think that's the cushion thing that I threw her. So for him to tell the Stevensons like they haven't located it yet, it's not necessarily true. But let's return to Brian's phone call with the Stevensons because it's about to get weird.
So after an hour of calling her, I never heard her voice. And a powerboat came by, and I waved my flashlight on my phone, and they were so fast they didn't even see it. And then there's another one came by right behind it, sort of 5 minutes behind it, and I grabbed the flares by then. I had 2 flares, and they didn't see the flares, I guess. And then I didn't know what the fuck to do. By the time I got the anchor set, I was probably a quarter to a half a mile away from her. And at that point, I was slightly closer to something which has a few houses on it, and I decided I had to go get help. But I could not get to the island with one paddle, and the tide carried me right the first house and then the second house. And so I ended up drifting and paddling for many hours until I landed on Marsh Island about 4 miles away.
So Brian says that he called to Lynette for an hour. He never heard her voice. And then not one, but 2 powerboats, meaning motorized boats, went right past him. And he shined a light at them and he set off 2 flares, but they didn't see the flares. For his account to work, you have to accept that Lynette could not hear him. He could not hear her. 2 passing motorboats did not see his light, did not see 2 flares, and no one nearby noticed distress signals in a fairly traveled boating area. So there's going to be other boats around. You're not too far from shore. Somebody's going to see a flare. The flare detail is especially important because marine flares are specifically designed to be noticed. And everyone in that area who's like on a boat or boating or familiar with anything nautical would see a flare and immediately realize it's a distress signal and like go to help. But nobody did because it never happened. But put a pin into this. We will come back to it. Brian also said that by the time he had the anchor set, he was about a quarter to a half a mile away from Lynette, and he was slightly closer to this island that had a few houses on it. Now, given the route Brian has provided, the island he's referring to is Lubber's Quarters Key, and that fits because Lubber's Quarters is described as a small, largely residential island between Elbow Key and the Great Abaco mainland, with no scheduled ferry service, no commercial amenities, and only a very small number of private homes. That fits if Brian is telling the truth to the Stevensons, and if the maps and the route he provided are correct. I just don't think any of it's true, and it's not just my intuition. There's a lot of reasons that I don't think Brian was anywhere near Lubber's Bank in the dinghy when he set off flares and did all this stuff. Lubber's Quarters Key has something called Lubber's Bank, which is a massive, shallow sandbar extending roughly 4 miles northwest from the north end of Lubber's Quarters into the Sea of Abaco. So the only route Brian could take from the location of the Abaco Inn past Lubber's Quarters would be the northern tip of Lubber's Quarters. So if Brian was where he says he was, doing what he said he was doing, this was not deep open water. He wouldn't have had to go all the way to visible shore to reach the shore of Lubber's Quarters. It would have been shallow enough for him at some point, like 4 miles out, to get out of the dinghy and pull the dinghy to the shore. Okay, I don't think he ever tried to paddle with one oar towards Lubber's Quarters and he was just getting pushed away by the tide. There's another reason why I don't believe Brian was ever in this area trying to get to the shore and sending off flares, but we'll come back to that.
We didn't get rolled out until 5. And by then, she had been in the water for 8 hours, and by midnight, I was already freaking out.
At this point, Brian's account seems to suggest 2 different levels of control. Earlier, he said the tide pushed him away from Lubber's Quarters, even though he was intentionally trying to paddle towards it. And later, he says he paddled towards Marsh Harbor and tried to get as close as possible to the boatyard, which was pretty well lit. So if the dinghy was so unmanageable that he couldn't reach this much nearer island, Lubber's Quarters Key, what changed later that allowed him to be like, oh, there's this specific lit boatyard of Marsh Harbor, let me use my one oar and steer towards it, and the conditions and the wind and all of that are going to allow me to do that. Now, here's something else I noticed. After this, Blaine Stevenson asked Brian how many people were out there looking for Lynette, and did he need more people? And Brian didn't answer this question. Instead, he said he believed that the following day would be the last good day because they were expecting a storm after that. He then says that his sister is flying in and he needs to rent a boat, and so he can go search for Lynette, and then he returns to telling the story about how he got to Marsh Harbor in the dinghy.
Paddled, there was nothing else to do. But hit the island as close as I could to that boatyard. It was pretty well lit. So the dinghy, I landed in some crazy-ass spot, like a movie. It was a little tiny 50-yard wide lagoon full of rocks and shit, and I beached it, and the cops, of course, are there thoroughly investigating me right now, so they came and tied the dinghy up. I just got the dinghy back today, and got the boat back to the harbor from where the anchorage was, so I have to rig some switches so I can single-hand it back there and conduct my own searches, but I can't tomorrow's. Yeah, it's a fuck story. But we have the Coast Guard, Hopetown Search and Rescue, the Bahamian Defense Force were out today and yesterday. So tomorrow the same thing again. I just don't know. I don't know what. It has to be tomorrow, I guess. I think they'll probably call it when the weather comes in. But I'm going out. They asked me today, the cops called me up and asked me how long I would be in the Bahamas. I'll get my wife back. And so that's my goal. I canceled everything we were going back home for, and I'm going to renew my visa and stay here. So I'll keep you posted on that. But, I mean,
This stood out to me because it feels like there was already a story Brian was planning to tell about this little lagoon with the rocks, like something out of a movie, and he needed to get that part of the story out before answering this other question. It's like he had a story with all these details that he planned to tell, and when a question was asked that he didn't anticipate in the middle of his rehearsed story, he almost had to go back to that story and remember where he was in the narrative before he could answer the question. And basically what Brian is saying is that the authorities took his dinghy because they are looking into him, and he just got it back that day when he's talking to the Stevensons, and he was able to get the soulmate back to the harbor, meaning Marsh Harbor, where Lynette and Brian had a mooring ball that they rented. Now, according to Blaine Stevenson, Brian spent about 3 to 4 hours searching for Lynette with the rescue officials on April 5th before he returned to the soulmate, where he remained for roughly the next 24 hours, and then he went to Marsh Harbor, where he went to the Conch Inn, and then he just kind of chilled there, like just sitting out on the porch of the Conch Inn, not searching for Lynette.
By day, I was keeping a very stiff upper lip because she is strong. She's a regular swimmer, not like a athlete or anything, but she's fucking determined, and she was the flare pistol I had slid down one of the sponsons down towards the stern, and the dinghy, I took so many waves over the dinghy, I bailed about 5 or 6 times. I had to bail out the cockpit, but the inside also got wet, and so, man, the dinghy key was not attached to me, so when we were fucking around trying to get back in the boat, the sun was falling when it fucking kind of dropped off. It was a magnet key, for the electric motor.
So you guys were swimming? Yeah, because you guys have the torpedo.
No. Yeah, we have a torpedo. Well, we have equivalent. We have a 3-horse electric. It's a different model, but
okay.
So this is the part of the conversation where Blaine Stevenson felt alarm bells going off in his head. Here he is on the Surviving the Survivor podcast explaining.
Man, the dinghy key was not attached to me. So when we were fucking around trying to get back in the boat,
right there,
the sun was falling when it fucking kind of.
Did you hear that? He says, so when we're effing around when we are trying to get back in the boat, and Blaine, again, explain why that is so important.
Because he's explaining that they're both in the water, like they both got knocked out. Like he's saying we are fucking around in the water. Excuse my language. I apologize.
No, not at all.
No,
not at all.
But that doesn't sound like my wife fell off and I lost her and I couldn't see her. He's also describing the sun was falling, so it hadn't gone down yet. So this is that initial 10 minutes he's describing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's describing it as we were both in the water at the time. Because I even asked him, I'm like, so you were swimming? And then he's like, no, I got it. And then he switches to the motor because I was stupid enough to ask 2 questions at once. As a parent, I know better than that.
He's saying that they're effing around, swimming around. We have never, correct me if I'm wrong, Blaine, but we've never heard this before or after this, correct?
I've been trying to bring it up. It's also like it would take like somebody with some seriously good editing time to go through both audios and collect the number of times he says his family is already on the island and his sister is arriving on the island. His in-laws are on the island already. His sister comes in tomorrow. I'm picking her up. There is that story, that narrative shifts so many times that I couldn't tell you who's on the island with him.
And the dinghy, I took so many waves over the dinghy, I bailed about 5 or 6 times I had to bail out the cockpit, but the inside also got wet. And so, man, the dinghy key was not attached to me, you know. So when we were fucking around trying to get back in the boat, the sun was falling when it fucking kind of dropped off. It was a magnet key, you know, for the electric motor.
So you guys were swimming? Yeah, because you guys have the torpedo.
No. Yeah.
And I agree. Brian Hooker's story that he's telling here is stupid and aimless for absolutely no reason. He said, we were in the water trying to get back in the boat. So you both fell out of the boat. And then he says, and at that point it was getting dark. So if you both fell out of the boat and then you knew where Lynette was, but it was just getting dark, which means it's going to be, I don't know, another 15 to 20, 25 minutes before it's like totally dark and you can't see her. So for 15 to 20 to 25 minutes, you did see her, but then you didn't anymore because it just got completely pitch dark. So once Brian Hooker reached the boatyard on Marsh Harbor in the early morning hours of April 5th, he encountered Edward Smith, a security guard at Marsh Harbor boatyards. And Smith said that Brian explained what had happened. He was exhausted. He asked for a drink, and he said that his wife was still in the water. So when Edward Smith asked what time Lynette had fallen in the water, and Brian said 7 p.m., once again, we have a changing story because according to you before, you didn't even leave the Abaco Inn until 7:30 p.m. But when Brian told Edward Smith 7 p.m., Smith was shocked and said, quote, so I say from 7 and you're just reaching the shore now? He said the wind was blowing so strong, so when that happened, the boat blew away from him and he couldn't really see in the dark, end quote. Brian told Edward Smith that when he had last seen Lynette, she was swimming back towards Hopetown with a yellow bag on her person. So now he's telling Edward Smith he's seeing her swim towards the shore. He told the Stevensons he saw her swim towards the shore, but he told his other friend that he saw her swimming towards the sailboat. So she's also got a yellow bag on her person now. And at this time, Brian was telling this to Edward Smith. Edward Smith noticed that Brian also had a yellow bag on. This is a dry bag. So Brian told Edward Smith the same sort of story. He would later tell the Stevensons that he had sent up 2 flares, but this time he said he sent up 1 flare when the first boat passed and the next flare when the second boat passed. But remember, in his story to the Stevensons, Brian had claimed he'd flashed his light at the first boat and then sent up 2 flares when the second boat passed. Anyways, he claims he sent up 2 flares. But a man named Dean Zamzel, who lives on Lubber's Quarters Key and who has security cameras pointing out across the Sea of Abaco towards where the Soulmate was anchored and Elbow Key, he begs to differ. And Dean provided this security footage to Ashley Banfield.
There's a catamaran parked just on, if you're looking at the image, parked to the left of what appears to be Soulmate, which would be just a little bit north of Soulmate. Soulmate is a little bit south of the catamaran. And Dean's video is kind of looking into the ass end, which we like to call the transoms of both of those boats. That tells you a big thing right there, a huge clue. Tells you the wind direction. Because as you know, if you throw an anchor down off the bow of a boat, you're going to swing on the fulcrum, right? You're going to swing around according to the wind. Maybe you'll swing this way when the wind shifts this way, and maybe you'll swing this way when the wind shifts, right? It's like you can tell, you know, just the way a wind would blow a boat if it's just hanging on an anchor, right? On an anchor chain. And the fact that Dean's video sees the ass end of these boats, sees their transoms, means that the wind was coming straight towards Dean's home, which would be southwest. Now, if that's the way the wind was blowing, how on earth did Brian's little dinghy blow northwest instead of southwest? The wind, you can see it minute by minute from Dean's security video. The wind is coming at him and kind of down the island, south. How'd you miss the north end of Lubbers? How'd you skip past the north end of Lubbers and end up all the way over at Marsh Harbor? That doesn't really make sense.
Now, allegedly, according to Brian in his messages to his friend Daniel Danforth, after Lynette went in the water, he was left with 1 oar to paddle with for the next 7 hours. Now, he does say that this other oar, the pin broke and it went overboard, But what happened to the oar then? What happened to the paddle? You'd think if you were especially that close to Lubber's quarters, and we can see the water is pushing towards Lubber's quarters, right? It is pushing, you can see in the surveillance video or the security video from Dean Zamzel's house on Lubber's quarters, the water's pushing directly towards Lubber's quarters. But you'd think that the oar that broke off and fell into the water would have washed up there, but it didn't. And Brian describes to Blaine Stevenson that, the pin in the oar breaking was just part of a cascade of failures. Now, my question would be, is the pin on the dinghy broken, right? Because officials obviously took that and looked at it. But is the pin where the oar would sit, is that broken? Does that match Brian's story? Now, we know that when Brian arrived at Marsh Harbor, he did still at least have one oar on the dinghy. He would have had to have had at least one because according to him, he had to paddle there. At this point, there is no police record publicly available to clarify whether he did or not. However, if the missing oar had broken off, like I said, where Brian claims Lynette fell in, based on where they were and the fact that the tide was moving directly towards Lubber's quarters, it should have washed up there. And it didn't. If Brian was depending on the wind to push him to where he would end up because he only had one oar, the wind would have pushed him right to Lubber's quarters, not to Marsh Harbor. But remember, Brian also claimed he sent off 2 flares while he was floating along by Lubber's quarters. And if that was true, and it was around 9 p.m. as Brian claimed, then Dean Zamzel's security footage would have picked up the light from those flares. And several people have scrubbed this video second by second, and no sign of any flares being sent up in the area can be seen. What can be seen, however, is a black dot that could be a dinghy, but not at the time Brian claimed, and not in the location he claimed.
And we think we can see like a black dot, which might be Brian and Lynette in their dinghy making it back to Soulmate. And it happens at about 7:44 Eastern time. Well, that's the time that he was saying Lynette went out, right? Somewhere between 7:44, 7:50, somewhere around there. Oh, she bounced out. We were 1,000 yards away from our boat. She bounced out. And it's hard to tell, but thank you to Katie and Julianne for enhancing best you can. If you look, it's almost perceptible to see a little black dot sort of crossing behind the big wide transom, heading left to right on your screen and crossing over the big wide transom of the catamaran, the big dual hull, and heading southward towards that monohull Soulmate. So bear with me here because this is hard to see. But we zoomed in as far as we can to this catamaran that is parked just to the left of Soulmate. So it's just north of Soulmate. They're both anchored. They're both blowing in the wind. But there is like a tiny speck of a black dot that sort of appears and then disappears. And it feels as though that might be a dinghy. It's hard to know what else it could be, but a dinghy is so incredibly small, you wouldn't be able to see it from that far away. But right up next to that white transom of the catamaran, that black dot just sort of appears and then sort of vanishes. Maybe with enhancement, you'd be able to see a better direction, you'd be able to see something else. But so far, this is the best we can do. And so don't shoot the messenger, but it is just sort of intriguing.
Now, Ashley Banfield went live with this information something like 6 weeks ago, and on its own, it's speculative, I suppose. Even though there are no flares on the security camera, it's pretty dumb to think that 2 passing boats would not see Brian and his dinghy sending off flares, which everyone who knows anything about boating would know. That was a call for help. So if Brian was sending off flares at his location by Lubber's quarters, the camera would have picked it up, but there are no flares. But even before I knew that, I already knew he didn't send flares off because there's no way passing motorized boats would see this little dinghy sending off flares and not do something to help. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So at the time the video with the speculative dinghy was taken, it was 7:44 p.m. And you can clearly see it's not even close to being dark. Even at 7:44 p.m., it's not even close to being dark. It's like, dusk, but it's not dark by any means. But Brian is saying when he's with Lynette in the water and she's going overboard at that time, around that 7:44, 7:45 time, It's completely pitch black. He can't even see her. Now, I would also like to bring your attention back to the picture of Lynette and Brian by the pool at the Abaco Inn, taken moments before they left at 6:38 p.m. In my opinion, they don't really look like happy, relaxed people in this photo. Lynette is in a lounge chair, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. Brian is sitting upright in the chair next to her, facing her. His head is down. It kind of looks like they've been arguing. So let's say they're arguing. They leave the Abaco Inn. They head back to the Soulmate. The argument continues. And that is where Lynette goes missing. And there was never a huge elaborate windstorm that threw the dinghy off course. There was never 4-foot waves that grabbed Lynette and pulled her into the ocean and then pushed Brian against his will to Marsh Harbor so many hours later that the amount of time it took to get to shore makes sense to absolutely no one, even if you only had one oar. Now, newer developments provide a lot of supporting evidence for this theory. The theory that when Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn, they did not get blown off course. They actually made it back to their boat, the Soulmate. So data obtained from Vessel Finder, a marine tracking system, shows that the automatic identification system on the Soulmate went dark at 9:29 p.m. on the evening of April 4th, 2026. Now, this is the system that broadcasts a vessel's identity, speed, and position, and it was not turned back on until 8:40 a.m. the following morning. But even though the Soulmate's primary tracking system was offline, Brian's phone was apparently running a specialized marine navigation app, probably that Navionics app, that happened to capture his precise coordinates. And reportedly, Brian's phone allegedly showed the device traveled out into the Sea of Abaco, stopped in an area that hasn't been disclosed to us, and later returned to shore, which is obviously nothing like the story he told and nothing like the route he said he took. And this has prompted new searches for Lynette because they had been looking for her where Brian claimed she had gone into the water, and now they realize that the dude lied, okay? Allegedly. So on the morning of April 5th, when Brian reached Marsh Harbor, exhausted and thirsty, and notified authorities, a large-scale search began for his wife, Lynette. The search covered water, shorelines, islands, aerial searches, drone operations, even divers in some locations. And during this period, at least initially on April 5th, Brian participated and cooperated in the search with authorities in the areas where Brian said Lynette had fallen into the water. Now, according to the security guard at Marsh Harbor, Edward Smith, the police arrived at about 5 a.m., and when Smith left his shift at 7 a.m., Brian was still there at the boatyard talking to law enforcement. So this is important because the police were there talking to Brian, but they'd already called the search and rescue boat, and the boat was kind of doing like its rounds looking for Lynette. Now, when the officials, the police, asked Brian what was Lynette last wearing, he said the last time he saw her, she was wearing a 2-piece black bathing suit. But he does not mention to the police the green cover-up we saw her wearing in the picture taken right before Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn. He doesn't mention the headscarf. He doesn't mention her sunglasses. He certainly doesn't mention her Apple Watch. And he's also not saying anything about a dry bag anymore. Now, Jim Todd with Hopetown Fire and Rescue said he got a call just after 5 a.m. that there was a missing woman in the water. So Jim and 3 other guys spoke to the police, and they got an idea of where they needed to start searching before getting in their boat and heading to the area between Elbow Key and Lubbers Quarters. They searched the northeastern shore of Lubbers, and then based on the direction of the wind, they moved north a little bit and followed the wind direction towards Great Abaco Island in the area of Marsh Harbor. They turned south and searched the shore of Marsh Harbor. They saw Brian's dinghy there along with a police officer and Brian as they passed. Jim Todd, his team in the boat, returned to where Brian Hooker and where the police were, and then several police officers and Brian Hooker got on the search boat and they headed back to the Soulmate. Now, this is important because when you ask how the AIS system, the tracking system on the Soulmate, could have been turned off the night before, on April 4th, the night of April 4th, and then turned back on at around 8:40 a.m. on the morning of April 5th, this is how, because Brian Hooker was back on the vessel at the time it came back online. So when they got to the sailboat, this is the Soulmate, Jim Todd said that Brian and 1 police officer boarded the Soulmate and remained on board for about an hour before returning to the search and rescue boat. An hour only monitored by 1 person, more than enough time and opportunity to switch the AIS back on. It would literally be at the most a flip of a couple of switches, at the least maybe 1 switch. And Brian could have just been like, oh, here, let me turn on the lights so we can see, and switch the system back on. So they go on there. Brian switches the system back on, in my opinion. Allegedly, don't come for me. The police then get back on the search and rescue boat with Brian. And then the police tell the search and rescue boat to completely circle the soulmate so that they could take 360-degree pictures of the sailboat. And this makes me believe that law enforcement were already suspicious of Brian's story, and they were trying to properly document what could have been the actual scene of the crime. And I believe that this was the actual scene of the crime. At least I believe that Brian made it back to the soulmate after they left the Abaco Inn. And I would say, based on when we probably saw this dinghy kind of headed towards the soulmate, on Dean Zamzel's surveillance footage from Lover's Quarters, which we saw the dinghy, or what we think is a dinghy, at approximately 7:44 p.m., it looks like at least Brian got back on the dinghy and headed back to the soulmate and probably made it there. We're going to talk about that in a second, and we're going to kind of have a timeline that's going to make more sense. So after this 360-degree circle was done around the soulmate so police could take pictures, the search and rescue boat headed off in the direction of where they'd been told Lynette had fallen off.
Brian Hooker was on the front of the boat, and I took it upon myself to go out and talk with him about exactly where he understood that to have happened.
How long were you up on the front of the search and rescue vessel with Brian as you all sort of tried to establish where it was that he says she went overboard?
I would say easily in the range of 10 minutes.
Talking to him?
Yeah. To say, okay, she fell off here. How close to land was that? Would she have swum in that direction, or would she have swum in this direction? It was that kind of conversation. I was just thinking about, where should we look? If she went off here and we were this close to land, what part of land might it be? And so where should we be looking?
Were you able to establish that?
No, I'll say, as I tried to become more specific, pointing at a particular piece of land, could it be there, or could it be a little bit further? Could it conceivably be behind? Brian said something along the effects of, I'm not sure, it's just so confusing. May not have been precisely those words, but the demeanor and the effect of his comments were, I can't be sure, it's just very confusing.
Brian has told friends and accounts, it seems, to authorities. He and Lynette came out from the Abaco Inn through the channel, took a left, and started going south towards where Soulmate was anchored. Did he say how close he was to the channel when this incident allegedly happened?
Yes, he told me that when they got to the end of the channel, they turned left at the last piling in the channel. They did not go further out to where there is a channel buoy.
For deeper seeking boats that have a more draft and need deeper water.
Right. So he said that he turned southward in the area of the last piling, and I assumed that it was west of that last piling.
How far out of the Abaco Channel did he say he was when he had turned left? How far out had he made it before he says she fell overboard?
He didn't say it in the context of feet or yards, but I was standing on the bow of the search boat, and I pointed to a piece of water and say, "You think it was right there?" And I would say it was in the range of 50 yards south of that last piling in the channel.
Very, very close to the channel.
Yeah, much closer. Yeah, much closer to the channel than to the boat, the sailboat.
Did he ever tell you that the last time he saw Lynette, she was swimming for the yacht Soulmate?
That was not said to me. He did say the last time he saw her, she was swimming away from him, and frankly, in my memory, it was to the land.
Jim Todd said that the place Lynette fell off the dinghy, the place Brian showed them, was far closer to the land than to the Soulmate, only 100 yards from the shore, actually. So once again, if Lynette fell off, as Brian said she did, and he saw her start swimming, why would she swim to the sailboat, which he's told multiple people the story that she was swimming towards a sailboat, which was 1,000 yards away, obviously way further, instead of to the shore, which was relatively close to the dinghy and objectively and factually way closer than the sailboat. And also, once again, Jim Todd is saying where Brian said Lynette went off is not far from the shore. 100, 200 yards. I think he said 100 yards, but not far from the shore at all. So it's really not deep there either. Just an FYI.
But I wouldn't have expected that. I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I wouldn't have expected someone falling into the water versus the dinghy to become separated so quickly. But it's plausible.
There's a lot of incidents in the story that are possible, plausible, but maybe not the number one possibility. If Lynette were driving, and Brian says she was, one thing I did notice, though, is that the electric key does not have a wristlet. It's just a long string. And Brian says she took it out with her. So what kind of a possibility is it that you've got your hand on the tiller, because Brian says she's driving, you're getting bounced out, you let go of the tiller, and you grab the string that's hanging down from the electric key?
I would say that the probability of what you describe of you're falling out and you grab the lanyard from the key, virtually it's approaching an impossibility. Another curious thing is that if someone has been on shore enjoying themselves at a bar and they're in a dinghy that maybe it doesn't have a radio or a portable radio like most would, it seems an odd thing that someone would have put the wristlet on, because they really were so close to the boat. It was only a 10-minute drive in the boat at most.
I've seen the pictures. There isn't a wristlet on that key. It's just a straight string that hangs down.
Right.
You'd have to grab for it and pull it out with you as you're being bounced out unexpectedly.
Yeah, you would.
It's very difficult to do
would. Although normal safety procedures is that would be attached to your wrist.
If you're by yourself.
So exactly this would happen.
If you're by yourself.
The boat stops.
If you're with someone in the boat, you don't want to take that key out with you and render them unable to come and get you.
Well, who knows?
Right. So the other question is, Brian says she went out with the lanyard and the key and went out with the dry bag. So if you're driving, that's not a dry bag necessarily that you may be wearing. Maybe it is. I'd have to look at it. But what are the chances that you're going to grab a dry bag and grab the lanyard and let go of the throttle and be bounced out unexpectedly?
If you were to fall out of a boat, it happens so fast you don't have time to think of anything. So virtually unheard of that someone would have the presence of mind or the thought that, I need to grab that.
A couple of things on the way out. A couple of things. Yeah.
It happens so quickly that you don't even, when something like that happens, you don't perceive it happening. You go from the state of driving the boat to the state of,
help me.
Bam, I'm in the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim Todd also acknowledged that based on Brian's timeline, it wouldn't have been dark when Lynette went into the water, which is the reason Brian gave for why he lost sight of her so quickly. And Todd said, well, maybe the times were off and it was actually later than Brian thought, which means it would have been dark. But there were still aspects of Brian's story that didn't line up with Jim Todd's extensive experience with the waters of this area.
I tied up on the boat for just a minute as he scrambled onto his boat. I don't remember how the conversation initially started, but he was concerned about retrieving his dinghy that was still on the beach.
You gave him contacts to help get the dinghy back.
Yeah. I think what I actually did is I took his contact information and sent it to someone.
Yeah. Did he ask, though, about what's happening now and how can I get connected to the search efforts and be a part of it? And, who's in command? Did he ask those questions?
On that day, on Sunday, I don't recall him asking those kind of questions. We may have talked about people searching in different areas, but we didn't have any significant conversation about it. I may have commented on people searching different areas, but there was no in-depth comment.
Did he ask for contact information to get to Coast Guard, search and rescue, anybody who'd be trying to find his wife?
Not on Sunday.
And Sunday,
that first day.
Listen, Sunday is like you said, within 12 hours of this all happening.
That's right.
But he didn't ask what's happening. What's happening in the search? Where do I contact someone about this?
I do not recall him asking me that. That's correct.
Is that odd?
Well, again, I could only put myself in that position. And I think I would have been desperate to know how many boats are out there. Where are they? I'm now back on my big boat. Who's going to come pick me up to take me out? And maybe it's unfair for me to take my feelings and to project them onto him. But that's certainly how I would have felt.
You want to know what's happening with the mission.
And be very actively a part of it.
So then the search and rescue boat heads back to Great Abaco to search the shoreline again. And at that point, someone on the boat points out something green that they see through the binoculars. It's on the shoreline of Great Abaco Island, south of where Brian's dinghy was. Brian was asked, hey, is this green float thing the thing that you said you threw out to your wife in the water? And he said that could be it. So the following Tuesday, Jim Todd did recover the green float from the beach of the shoreline. So that was the green float. And remember, Brian is seeing this through the binoculars on April 5th, and he's telling the Stevensons that they haven't found it yet on the 6th. And then obviously on the 7th, Jim Todd goes back and he gets it and they verify. But Jim Todd said they pretty much knew that that's what it was. Like it was the same color, it was the same size. It had washed up where, they kind of expected it to. Interesting. So Jim Todd said that Brian's demeanor was subdued and despondent, and he remembered thinking that if he, Jim, was in a similar position with his wife, he would be inconsolable and unable to function. So then Jim Todd was tasked with driving Brian back to the soulmate after this very limited search.
There's new information from the timestamps and the video that Lynette's daughter Carly and her boyfriend Steve saw that show Lynette and Brian walking out of the Abaco Inn and towards the dock at 6:38-ish. That changes things for you.
Yeah, it really does. It changes it a lot because the initial story of leaving at 7:30 plus, maybe I gave some grace to say that 7:30 could easily become 7:45. And then as you approach 8 o'clock, it's very dark at 8 o'clock. But if the departure was notably earlier, and really I'm saying now what I'm describing is if the departure was from 6:45, really all the way up to 7:30, then that's different. The first version was leaving at dusk, going to dark. But the new timestamp might make it from daylight going to dusk. And that's really a completely different equation. And some of the things of the story just don't hold up.
Well, listen, the dinghy ride out of the White Sound Channel, away from the Abaco Inn, out the White Sound Channel, take a left, head towards Soulmate. That whole dinghy ride's around 10 to 15 minutes. And if you're leaving, and again, I got to be careful because we don't yet know, they're leaving the inn. We don't see the video of them getting in the boat and going. Maybe they went for a walk. Maybe they had a chat on the dock. Maybe they sat on the beach for a bit. But if they went right to the boat and got into that dinghy and took off, that would put them at the spot where he said that Lynette went over at maybe 6:50. Let's just say 6:55. And I could get a suntan at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've had a thought that maybe is a little bit independent of a dependence on the timestamp of that video. Anyone who's been on a sailboat for a long time, anybody who's been around the water, anybody who has a fragile craft is going to be careful to not go out in darkness. So I can't imagine someone not being I mean, it's well known that sailors watch the weather. They watch the sun go down. They avoid going out at night. It's just not done in a fragile craft. There's no reason to press it. And there's no moon that night. I think the moon came up at 10 p.m. So
if he's heading up that White Sound Channel at around 6:50, it's 6:50 p.m. where you are right now as we are recording this, and it is a bright sun behind you. That means there's no way you would lose sight of someone in the water as though it were too dark to see. Not for almost another hour.
That's right. It's total daylight here. Total daylight. And
like bright daylight.
Yeah. Yeah. And it will be for another 45 minutes. And I think,
and that's a lot of grace. 45 minutes, that's a lot of grace because again, it's only about a 15-minute trip max in that little 2 to 4 horsepower from the Abaco Inn to the Soulmate where it was anchored.
And to me, here's a dilemma that's unanswerable or a problem either way. Brian said that his wife was driving the dinghy, right? And I understand that her daughter Carly has said that he didn't let her drive the dinghy. Well, he probably did. He happened to mention to me when I was with him and returning him from Marsh Harbor to his boat, he happened to mention to me as a point of pride, as a point of independence, that his boat, Soulmate, had not been tied up to a dock in a marina in 2 years. In 2 years, it had always been on a mooring ball or at anchor. Well, if the boat has been for 2 years on a mooring ball at anchor, Lynette would have learned how to drive the boat. Maybe she didn't drive it a lot, but she would have been competent at it. That's just the reality of being on a sailboat for 2 years. So now let's go back to that night at approximately 6:30 or 6:45 or 7 o'clock. Sure, typically men drive of a sailing couple. The man might be the one most common to drive the dinghy. But if a man were to pass the controls over to his wife, that would be an indication that the water was very safe, that it was daylight. Here's a good time. Here's a nice occasion for the wife to take the controls and I can relax.
Jim is a nice guy, a fair guy, I think, but I also think the implication here is clear. Brian was concerned about getting his dinghy back, but did not show the same concern about getting his wife back. He was asking questions and trying to figure out who he could get in touch with, who he could talk to about getting the dinghy returned, not asking questions about who he should talk to or what was going on in the search for Lynette and why did he want the dinghy back so much, because does he have some place to go to do some covering up? To, make sure everything's as he left it on the night of April 4th when he was doing something and maybe hiding things and maybe getting rid of things? And does he need to make sure that he actually did a good job because he was in a rush to do it on April 4th? I don't know. But this is Jim Todd talking to Ashley Banfield in the earlier days of all this happening, before things started coming out. And then later, when things started coming out, and when, people were kind of like looking at the changing stories and the timelines, Jim Todd talked to Ashley Banfield again.
And when Ken, the bartender, said that, I'm characterizing Ken's words, no, I wouldn't call him drunk, maybe tipsy at most. That makes me think that
surprised you.
That makes me think that, okay, he was sober and functional, and anybody in that boat would have been able to perform effectively. For example, we found out another important point to me was that there were 2 life jackets in the boat. Well,
in the bottom of the dinghy.
In the bottom of the dinghy. He would know that. They know that there's 2 life jackets there. In good weather, or really bad, but in good weather, something happens. He threw this green cushion that's so flat, it would have sailed like a sheet of paper. Well, there's another life jacket there. You could pick that up and throw it sideways, kind of like a discus, and it would have more force, so you could get more distance on it. If that's not effective, again,
throw the
everybody,
second life jacket.
I would grab the last life jacket and go over the side.
And go over.
And
You're only 150 yards from shore. You're a U.S. Marine. You can manage this. Don't worry about the dinghy. You're not going to be in the middle of the ocean and both die.
If you accept the story, you have to suspend belief on so many things that don't add up. And the original obvious thing is the one that requires so much disbelief.
Jim Todd is a little more spicy here. He's saying things with his chest. He also said that when he heard Lynette was driving, right? Because according to Brian, Lynette's driving. He assumed, oh, maybe that's because Brian had too much to drink. Because honestly, it may sound misogynistic to people or old-fashioned, but in this boating community, a lot of the men are like that. They're like, I'm going to drive the boat. Like, especially if the conditions aren't good, I'm going to be the one to drive the boat. So Jim Todd assumed Brian must have been like drunk, and that's why Lynette was driving the boat. And then he found out that they'd only had 2 drinks at the Abaco Inn, spread out over a pretty good amount of time, like several hours.
Right now, the clock is ticking for authorities in the Bahamas. They have until later today to hold Brian Hooker for questioning. According to Bahamian law, authorities can only hold him for 48 hours. They will likely have to seek an extension today, release him from custody, or file charges. New today, we're hearing from his attorney. The attorney says Brian is calling this entire thing tragic and that he's heartbroken at the disappearance of his wife.
So Jim Todd goes on to say a lot more about why the whole thing seems off. And then he talks about how Brian never told them that Lynette was wearing that green cover-up. And he said he felt it was odd even then when he first heard what Lynette was wearing when she was last seen by Brian. He said he felt it was odd that a woman would be at the Abaco Inn with just a bathing suit and no cover-up on. Because, yeah, there's a pool and there's an ocean, but there's also like an inside area where you go to get drinks and you can have dinner. And it's like, an inn. So you're not going to just be walking around in a bathing suit and not a cover-up as a woman in a place where you can have dinner and stuff. I mean, they might not even allow it. Now, I wanted to show you clips from both interviews with Jim to show you that initially, even though things seemed off, Jim was giving Brian Hooker the benefit of the doubt. He was trying to be fair, and I think that's just who he is. But with all of his experience in search and rescue, all his experience with not only being a boater himself, but being a boater in these exact waters that we're talking about, and with all of the things that were coming out, Jim Todd can't deny what is right in front of us. Even fair, nice Jim Todd, who's not jaded like I am and like probably a lot of you are, he can't, overlook all of these things that seem odd to him now. So Brian spoke to the authorities on April 5th, Sunday, for several hours, and then the following Wednesday, April 8th, he was taken into custody by the Bahamian police and placed under arrest, and the police said they took him into custody for questioning based on probable cause. The following day, Brian was transferred by Bahamian authorities from Marsh Harbor to Freeport, where he was questioned again for several hours. Brian's lawyer said he was questioned in relation to causing harm to Lynette, which caused her death, but the lawyer said they've got no evidence. Now, Brian would be detained between April 8th and April 13th, and at some point during that time, the police brought Brian back to the Soulmate so they could conduct a search for evidence, and an incident happened where Brian got a skinned knee, and we're supposed to feel bad for him.
He is not saying he had any intention to harm her or kill her. He's not saying that he did any action that caused her death. He's saying she fell.
And new in the last several hours, the attorney also says Hooker fell overboard from his boat while in handcuffs. The attorney saying that was during a police search on the night of his arrest. The attorney says officers had to pull him from the water and he had a knee injury and a scrape. His attorney has requested medical attention on his behalf, and police say he'll be taken to the local hospital for evaluation.
So Brian's attorney, Terry Butler, said that Brian was holding a bundle of clothing in his restricted hands. He was trying to maintain his balance amid choppy and dangerous sea conditions, and he lost his footing and fell overboard. Butler said, quote, he was submerged in the cold water and in a significant amount of seawater before his life jacket brought him to the surface. He had to be rescued from the water by the police. End quote. Aw, poor baby. It sucks to be thrown into the water when you're not expecting it, huh? But at least Brian was wearing a life jacket. okay? Lynette didn't have a life jacket. Brian, when she bounced off the dinghy and went into the water, she was submerged in a great amount of seawater for far longer than the 45 seconds you were in there flailing around like an idiot. I mean, this dude fell overboard in a life jacket and still wants to be the victim while his wife is missing, allegedly lost at sea, and he's being questioned for hours upon hours in connection to her disappearance because he hasn't been truthful about what happened. I feel terrible. I hope he got a Band-Aid for his little baby knee. I feel really bad for him. I don't. I guarantee you this dude threw himself into the water on purpose. I guarantee you, okay? He was like, let me just cause a ruckus, distract from the search, just get attention, just have something to cry about later. Gross. So on April 13th, Brian was questioned again, and his lawyer said that this lasted less than an hour. The police did not present any new evidence. Then he was released from police custody. Now, after getting out, Brian, of course, went right to the news to show how sad and innocent he was.
Did police ever explicitly ask you if you hurt your wife?
Of course.
What did you say to them?
I said I've never harmed Lynette, and I never would harm Lynette, and I want to find Lynette. It's been 10 days. It's been a long time. I don't think I've ever been apart from her in 25 years for this long. I don't like it.
Oh, good Lord. Good Lord, Brian. All right, so Brian says he would never hurt his wife. They have this amazing marriage, etc. She's the love of my life. She is my life. But as he sat in police custody for several days, a bunch of stuff started coming out about Brian's past, about his relationship with Lynette. So first of all, Brian's was in the U.S. Marine Corps for a while. So he's not like a person who doesn't know how to survive or like think on his feet. So all of these like failures happening and him not anchoring the boat, the dinghy, right when Lynette went off and waiting until he had drifted away from her, all of him not being able to figure out like, was it dark? Was it light? I don't know what the tides were doing. I don't know. No, you're a professional boater. You live on a boat. You know about tides. You know about wind. And you were in the Marine Corps. You know about like, surviving and making things happen when they're not ideal, even if there's a cascade of failures happening. But anyways, let's go back to 2005 when Brian was detained by the Kentwood Police Department in Michigan after his previous partner, Elizabeth Hoseth, called the police and claimed Brian had assaulted their homeschooled daughter, who was staying with Brian and Lynette at that time for a scheduled visitation. So Lynette was this child's stepmother. The child was away from her biological mother, Elizabeth, at Brian and Lynette's home, and apparently Brian became enraged by a book his daughter was reading because he didn't want her to believe in God, and this was apparently a creationist science book, even though that seems like a contradiction. He chased his daughter up the stairs and grabbed her by the neck. One of Brian's stepdaughters allegedly saw this happen, and Elizabeth Hoseth said, quote, she saw her dad hold the daughter up in the air by the neck, end quote. In a later interview with the police, the stepdaughter told police that Brian had lifted his daughter's feet up to 1.5 feet off the floor. The police report stated, quote, she turned and he grabbed her around the neck and picked her up by the neck, slammed her against the wall and started choking her. He was holding her above his head, end quote. The police report also said that Brian eventually let go of his daughter's neck and then was, quote, disappointed that he hadn't left his thumbprints, end quote. Pictures in the police record show the child with red marks on her neck, and she suffered a neck strain during the attack. Brian also reportedly said he would take his daughter's mother to court because she was homeschooling his son and daughter with a creationist education. He also allegedly called his daughter a shithead, stuck-up, manipulative bitch, according to the police documents. Also, Brian reportedly emailed his daughter's stepfather on November 8th, the day that the incident happened, stating, quote, the kids and I had a rough time tonight, end quote. Understatement. Brian wrote that he'd been triggered by his daughter calling him a bastard after the argument over the book. Now, Brian Hooker was arraigned on the charge of 4th-degree child abuse and was ordered to not have contact with his children. And his wife, Lynette, testified that he had not choked his daughter, and the case was later dismissed. Then, in February of 2015, the police were called to Brian and Lynette's home after Brian accused Lynette of assaulting him and striking him multiple times in the face. Police arrived to find both Brian and Lynette intoxicated and Brian bleeding from his nose. Brian claimed Lynette had struck him several times, while she claimed he had choked her and punched her in the forehead. The documents say that the pair refused medical treatment and charges were subsequently dropped as it wasn't clear who had started the fight or who had done what. Now, Lynette's daughter, Carly, she said she was there at the time during that incident, and she did see Brian choke her mother. And Carly also spoke out about past issues of domestic violence between her mother and Brian and how she did not believe her mother had accidentally fallen out of the dinghy. She said, quote, "I hope this was just a freak accident, but I just have a hard time believing it at the moment. I just want to know the truth. I feel like this was probably pre-planned, if anything, like it doesn't seem like just an accident," end quote. Carly said her mother and Brian had a history of not getting along, especially when they were drinking. Carly said that Brian had previously choked Lynette and threatened to throw her overboard, so, quote, "The fact that this is actually happening makes me believe there's more to the story," end quote. And then we have texts that Lynette Hooker sent Marnie Stevenson in January of 2024. So Marnie Stevenson, wife of Blaine Stevenson, the same people who recorded their phone conversation with Brian Hooker because they already felt like something wasn't right with that dude and he was shady. So on January 29th, 2024, Lynette sent Marnie the following message. Quote, "I guess it was too much closeness. We decided to call it quits. I'm not going back. Good luck, guys," end quote. Now, the Stevensons had met Lynette and Brian the previous year while they were all sailing through Florida. And remember, we talked earlier about how at this time Lynette and Brian were sailing around New Orleans, Florida, etc. And Lynette was documenting a lot of this on Instagram and on their YouTube channel, The Sailing Hookers. So Marnie was asking on January 29th how far south Lynette and Brian had made it, because she and Blaine were going to be starting this same path and the same trek in March, like they were headed to the Bahamas. And this is when Lynette lets Marnie know that she and Brian have split up. And Marnie said she was sorry to hear that. And Lynette wrote back, quote, "Me too. Heartbroken considering I quit my awesome career, sold my house, and gave away everything I own to cruise. SMH stupid," end quote. So Marnie asked how long Lynette and Brian had been sailing together, and Lynette said, quote, "We were married 21 years. Our marriage lasted 6 weeks cruising," end quote. Lynette told Marnie that she had left Brian and she was staying with her mother in Florida. Now, Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, told News Nation that Lynette had left Brian multiple times before this after several instances of alleged abuse, including one incident that had left Lynette with visible bruising on her back. Darlene said, quote, "With the lifestyle that my daughter and her husband live, I'd been preparing for that phone call for a long time. There was a lot of good times and bad times in my daughter's relationship with her husband, a lot of highs and a lot of lows. When it was fun, it was really fun. And when there were bad times, they were bad times. I think they loved each other, but they were not good for each other," end quote. So Darlene saying when she got the call, meaning Lynette was missing and had gone overboard, it's like she expected that, right? Given the intense relationship that existed between Lynette and Brian, that it was very like push-pull. Like when times were good, they were in love and they were as happy as they could be. And then when times were bad, it was very dark. Now, Darlene said that Brian tended to be mean and hateful and would get physical with Lynette sometimes when he was drinking. And Lynette would often take photos on her body of the aftermath when this happened. And although those pictures were supposed to remind Lynette to not go back to Brian, she always did. Darlene said that Lynette had booked a plane ticket to go back to her mother's the month before she vanished in the Bahamas, which indicated to Darlene that the abuse was once again escalating and those bad times were coming back around. So back to the messages between Lynette and Marnie, which basically support a lot of what Lynette's mother said. Lynette told Marnie that it wasn't that she didn't love sailing, she did, and she also had a friend in NOLA who had invited her to cruise, but she wasn't sure, and there was just too much going on right now to think about it, and then she said, quote, "It would be weird without my Brian," end quote. This is very similar, once again, to the Gabby Petito Brian Laundrie situation, right? Where it seemed like Gabby knew things were bad, but there was this weird trauma bond or like toxic bond where she felt very like codependent or just completely dependent on Brian Laundrie. So Marnie asked Lynette if there was a chance that she and Brian would reconcile, and Lynette said, quote, "Not this time. It was real bad. I can't be out there with him," end quote. So back to the Instagram account that Lynette was posting pictures on as she sailed around with Brian. Remember, I said there was a big gap between January of 2024 with the last post that year showing that Brian and Lynette were in Fort Myers Beach, Florida. The next post does not happen until January 25th, 2025, when it was announced that they were heading south, right? So this would be less than 3 months before Lynette disappeared in the Bahamas. And according to messages between Lynette and Marnie in February of 2024, just a month after Lynette said she left Brian, Marnie sent Lynette a message on February 29th, and the message said, quote, "Looks like things are on the up and up," end quote. And Lynette responded with 3 heart emojis and a thumbs up emoji. So it's likely that Marnie saw something on Facebook that suggested Lynette and Brian were back together. So not knowing like how bad it was or what was really going on, Marnie was like, hey, it looks like, you did work things out after all. And Lynette doesn't have a lot to say, just heart emojis and a thumbs up, right? Because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing at this point. What are you going to say? What are you going to say at this point? Like, oh yeah, he's changed, we're better. No, at this point, you just respond with as little as you possibly can, because it's embarrassing to be in Lynette's shoes. And a lot of people have been in Lynette's shoes. And when I say it's embarrassing, I'm not saying that in like a shameful way, because I too have been in Lynette's shoes. I'm saying it as it's embarrassing. And you almost, kind of are like, man, I wish Marnie wouldn't reach out to me, because this is embarrassing. So yeah, Lynette and Brian were back together shortly after she said she was leaving him. Now, according to Lynette's daughter, Carly, Lynette and Brian got married immediately after Lynette divorced her first husband and Carly's father, Rick. And Carly said, quote, "She's never really been single, so I don't think she knows how to be. She really clung onto that relationship any way she could," end quote. The relationship with Brian Hooker is what Carly's talking about. Yes, because I'm sure Brian made Lynette feel very, very, very loved. Like the only woman in the world, like the most special person to him. And then, there's alcohol, there's anger, and things swing the other way. But then the next day, the sun rises and everyone's sobered up and you're back to, being the love of his life. So we clearly have longstanding issues of overdrinking, violence in the marriage, and on again, off again dynamic. And then we put these two people together in isolation on a boat, and we're supposed to believe that Lynette accidentally fell off a dinghy and vanished in 3 to 4 foot waves in broad daylight 100 yards from the shore. Okay, Brian. Yeah, okay. So after his release from police custody, the Bahamian authorities made it clear that Brian Hooker was still being looked at as a suspect. The investigation was not over. And as Brian Hooker was walking out of the police station, he told NBC News, "I'm not going anywhere. It is my main goal to keep searching for my wife. I have no plans to leave the Bahamas." He said, "They're going to have to make me leave." Right? They're going to have to make me leave. He said his sole focus was to get back on the boat and then hire or beg people to help him go and search different areas. He said he was going to stay in the Bahamas until his visa ran out. And he said being in custody in the Caribbean was hell before he started sobbing. He said, and I quote, "I will always think there was something I could have done differently. My one job was to look out for her, and that has not happened. And I'm going to keep looking out for her now the best I can. I'm going to keep going. I'm not leaving until I'm told to leave or convinced that it's fruitless." End quote. Moving words from a loving, dedicated husband. And then the very next day after he said these words, Brian Hooker left the Bahamas. He left the Bahamas and he went back to the United States, leaving his lawyer behind to explain that Brian's mother was very ill and he needed to be at her bedside during this critical time. Wow, that's some good timing. Your mother becomes critically ill the day after you tell everybody in the Bahamas that you're never leaving until you find your wife. The lawyer was like, "Don't worry. Brian fully intends to come back to the Bahamas because, of course, his sole mission is to search for his wife, Lynette." Now, do you think Brian Hooker ever went back to the damn Bahamas? No, he never did. He has never returned. He has never begged or paid people to search areas. And I ask you, could he get any more suspicious? And get this, Brian Hooker's current whereabouts are unknown. We don't know where he is. So the investigation into what had happened to Lynette did not stop, however, right? Brian didn't come back, but they were still looking for her, and the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service became heavily involved, as well as the FBI. The FBI's running evidence and stuff through the forensics lab at Quantico. So in early May, remember, Brian bounced. He's out of the Bahamas the second he gets released from custody. But in early May, Brian hired commercial captains to transport his sailboat, the Soulmate, from where it was docked in Marsh Harbor and bring it to Florida. So Brian doesn't even have the balls to go back to the Bahamas to get the sailboat himself because he knows he'll be arrested, right? But anyways, that's neither here nor there. 40 miles off the coast of Melbourne, Florida, the sailboat was seized by the U.S. Coast Guard and taken to Fort Pierce for forensic processing. And that's when they started looking at the onboard electronics, the navigation systems, and the sailboat itself for forensic evidence. And it was then reported that the Soulmate had an infrared camera on board that was capable of detecting heat radiation and also had cloud memory.
Experts say this camera could hold key evidence in the disappearance of Michigan mother Lynette Hooker.
They showed me he has something called a FLIR system, which is a forward-looking infrared camera.
Daniel Danforth, a friend of the Hookers, toured their boat in 2023. He says Brian showed off the high-tech camera capable of detecting heat radiation.
He said if any person comes up in a boat or a kayak or something like that or walks down the dock, it immediately set off alarm and it'll self-track them as they walk around the boat.
Sources close to the investigation say the camera was on the sailboat when it was seized by the U.S. Coast Guard earlier this month. It's unclear if Hooker used it to search for his wife.
So if someone goes overboard, would it be helpful in looking for them?
Absolutely, because if it's at nighttime and it's in the dark, the FLIR is going to immediately capture the heat of that person's body.
Private investigator Robert Crispin.
Seizing a vessel is a great piece of evidence because all these electronics are digital evidence, and it doesn't go away, and you can't delete it, and you can't erase it. It's there forever.
The private investigator told me that data from this camera and from other devices on board could be key in determining what happened in the days before and after Lynette's disappearance.
Once again, I think it's fair to point out the obvious. If Lynette went off the dinghy closer to the Soulmate than to the shore, which I don't know. I don't think she went off the dinghy. So once again, we're kind of talking about different lies that none of them are the truth. So it's like, which version of the lie are we talking about? According to the search and rescue boat, Brian showed them a spot Lynette had gone off the boat that was 100 yards from the shore, but Brian was telling people that they were by the Soulmate. So either way, if Lynette had gone off the boat and Brian couldn't find her and he knew he had an infrared camera on board, wouldn't Brian have tried to get to the Soulmate or go 100 yards towards the other shore, like the shore of the Elbow Key where he said that they were, or to Lubber's quarters, and then get to the sailboat so you can use the infrared camera to look for her in the water while, there's a chance she's still alive, not 7 to 8 to 9 hours later when you finally wash up on Marsh Harbor, thirsty and exhausted. I mean, you have to look at this. No matter where he says she went off the boat, Brian still, in the dinghy, would have been closer to multiple other areas, including the Soulmate, way closer than to Marsh Harbor, but he claims because he only had one paddle or one oar and the tides and the wind were pushing him towards the area of Marsh Harbor, that's just where he ended up and he didn't have a choice. But once again, we know the winds and the tides were not pushing towards Marsh Harbor, they were pushing towards Lubber's quarters, so whatever, it's just a lie. He should have gone back to the sailboat and used the infrared camera on board to detect the heat of Lynette's body in the water, but he didn't have a choice. He just got pushed to Marsh Harbor by the winds and the tides. But once again, as we saw from the security cameras on Lubber's quarters, the wind appeared to be pushing northwest towards Lubber's, which means an unpowered dinghy would have drifted towards Lubber's. Brian would have gotten help within an hour of the incident. He could have been back on the sailboat within 90 minutes, and he could have used the infrared camera to find Lynette in the water. But honestly, I think he was on the sailboat, and I think he could have used the infrared camera. But because what he said happened didn't happen, he knew Lynette was not in the water. All right, so let's talk about what we do have and what we do know. We have pictures of Lynette taken at the Abaco Inn, pictures of Lynette and Brian taken at the Abaco Inn the night he claims she fell into the water, bounced out of the dinghy. We have surveillance footage that Lynette's daughter says puts Brian and Lynette leaving the Abaco Inn at approximately 6:38 p.m. The bartender that night verifies this. He says he served the hookers their last round between 6 and 6:30 that night. Brian told investigators that they left the Abaco Inn later that evening around 7:30 p.m., and then Lynette fell off the dinghy shortly after dark. which still it wouldn't have been dark. On April 4th, the sun did not set in the Bahamas until around 7:30, and that's just its setting. There's still like a lot of light in the sky. We saw that 7:44 video, which showed it was still pretty light at that time. We also now have evidence of Brian, or somebody we believe to be Brian, who looks exactly like him and is wearing that dry bag, that yellow dry bag. We see Brian walking towards the south dock at the Apico Inn at 7 p.m. He is alone. He is not with Lynette. He has a yellow dry bag. The picture was taken by a woman who was standing at the inn taking pictures of the sunset, which was happening at that time. The sun was setting. It had not set. Earlier that evening, a different photo taken at 5:41 p.m. verified that Lynette and Brian's dinghy was parked and tied up at this exact south dock. So at 5:41, the dinghy's at the south dock. They go to the Apico Inn, they have their drinks. They leave the inn's bar together at 6:38 p.m. to go to the dinghy. This is seen on surveillance. Brian's back at the south dock where the dinghy was anchored or tied up or whatever. He's back at the south dock alone at 7 p.m. That means, I think, something happened to Lynette in that short amount of time. So where is she? Something happened to Lynette to separate her and from Brian in that 22-minute window right at the water's edge. Now, maybe Lynette had to go to the bathroom and she meets him there later, and we just don't see this because, like I said, we see Brian walking towards the dinghy at the south dock alone at 7, but it's a woman taking a picture. It's not like a surveillance video where it's constantly going. So maybe Lynette was right behind him. Maybe he's one of those dickhead guys that walks way ahead of his wife. I don't know. Either way, this destroys Brian's timeline, claiming that they were happily riding in the dinghy together at 7:30 p.m. until, 15 minutes afterward that she's being thrown out of the dinghy with these horrible waves. We also have another timeline, a timeline that concerns and focuses on the sailboat, the Soulmate. So at 5:41 p.m., we have a picture of the Soulmate anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay. That's where Brian said they were anchored. We know that this is where they were anchored. The photograph taken at this time confirms the water was dead calm. The boat's anchor light was off. It was still daylight. So at 7:41 p.m., another photo shows the Soulmate again, once again. The Sea of Abaco is perfectly calm. And according to Brian, at this time, he and Lynette were fighting for their lives in the dinghy, battling waves that were 2 to 4 feet high at this time, when we can see at, 7:44, the Sea of Abaco is totally calm. So then remember, at 7:44, we see in that surveillance footage from Lubber's Quarter what could be a dinghy traveling towards the Soulmate, right? Because this is coming from the direction that the Abaco Inn would be. And remember, I said they had to leave the Abaco Inn, and then they sort of go out this little area, they turn left, and then they would have to turn into Aunt Pat's Bay. So this is the direction the dinghy would be coming from if it was Brian and Lynette's dinghy heading to the Soulmate. So we see that. Then, at 7:47, a shore-based surveillance camera captured a distinct sudden light event directly on or immediately next to the Soulmate. So at this point, it looks like maybe this time might mark the time that Brian returned to the sailboat. We see the dinghy pulling up at 7:44, 7:47, lights on at the Soulmate. Now, the light is believed to have come from Brian's activities on the sailboat when he returned, such as him flipping on the vessel's primary lights, deck lights, cabin lights, etc. He may have even been using a high-powered flashlight if he was trying not to draw attention. But the shore surveillance camera definitely picked up some sort of light activity on or around Soulmate at that time. And then at around 8 p.m., the video captured a bright flash resembling a marine flare being fired near the Soulmate, the sailboat. And then additional lights are spotted on the Soulmate around 12:27 and 12:32 a.m. So that would be April 5th in the morning. So 12:27 and 12:32 a.m., there's more lights happening. So watch all of the videos of all of the lights, and then we'll discuss.
The way it's been described to me, this light event at 7:47 p.m. that looks to be coming from Soulmate across the way, about a mile away, it kind of like the light goes on, and then it kind of dims a little bit, and then goes on again. And that is consistent with someone coming up to the boat, triggering it, then getting on board and maybe masking it a little bit until you can get to the switch and shut it off. So the pink dot, we nail it onto the screen at 7:47 when we can see boats in the light time, and we can make our estimation of, we think that might be soulmate. And so we mark that spot with the pink dot. But the videos at 12:27 a.m. are very dark, but the pink dot's still there. So above it would be where soulmate is supposed to be anchored. That's our estimation. And as we play this, I want you to watch very carefully what's coming in from the left-hand side of the pink dot, because it appears that a flashlight is kind of swinging around, looking like swinging around, and then what? The light on board, what we think is soulmate, goes on. The automated light? Don't know, but the flashlight really fires right into Dean's camera and then kind of stays lit. And soulmate's light, if it's soulmate, stays lit, that triggered spotlight on the back riggings. So now we've got, perhaps the rigging light and the lower light being maybe a dinghy light. And what you're going to see is the soulmate light. It might actually go off in a moment. Just watch. And is that because someone from the dinghy got up on board and then shut it off? Because it goes off, but the dinghy light stays on. What is fascinating is as you continue to watch this, the dinghy light's going to go off soon. If again, this is the dinghy and soulmate. But just so you know, all those other lights everywhere, those are other boats, and they're also lights on land that are high up. Those are lights on Elbow Key. But again, you see the dinghy light go off right around the pink dot, which is where we marked soulmate. Okay, now let's go to the next light event. And this is at 12:32 a.m. So this is 5 minutes after the last event that we saw in the darkness. So 12:32 a.m. at 0 seconds, watch the left-hand side again of the pink dot. And at 3 seconds, all of a sudden, there's 5 flashes of what I think might be a flashlight moving around in a lower boat. But at around 5 seconds, the big light on the back of the boat again illuminates, if it is the trigger light that we think it might be. But this solid light stays on until about 53 seconds. Watch it as it goes off. But that big light stayed on until about 53 seconds, and then off it went. So the flashlight had only flashed about 5 times, if that's what that is, right up next to soulmate. Then the trigger light on the back of the stern there, that seemed to be on, again, if it's soulmate, for up until 53 seconds, and all that happened at 12:32 a.m.
So according to Brian, Lynette was knocked out of the dinghy at like 7:30 or 7:45 p.m., whatever. It depends on what timing, you're believing from him. But from 7:47 p.m. on, there is all sorts of activity happening on and around the soulmate. And I mean, we see what could potentially be a dinghy, a dark spot, a dinghy riding up to the soulmate at 7:44. So this leads me to believe that Brian and Lynette were never out in the water on the dinghy. They never got blown off course. They were never 3 to 4 foot waves getting tossed around. He never shouted her name into the pretend darkness. He never saw her swimming towards the shore. He never saw her swimming towards the soulmate. None of this ever happened, which leads to the next question of what did happen. Something happened. Now, did it happen on the sailboat? Could Lynette and Brian have been fine and we just didn't see Brian, or we didn't see Lynette in that picture at 7 p.m. with Brian because she was behind him, or maybe she had to use the bathroom or whatever, and they got on the dinghy and they got back to soulmate no problem, at 7:44, whatever. And then something happened on the soulmate. Maybe they continued drinking. Maybe they were fighting about something at the pool at the Abaco Inn, and the fight continued when they got to the soulmate, and then something happened, and then Brian went out in his dinghy, because we know the soulmate didn't leave, right? But we know from the GPS, from Brian's phone, allegedly according to the authorities, that he did travel out into the Sea of Abaco and then come back to shore. And he stopped someplace for a short time, then he came back to shore. So we know that. So he didn't take the sailboat. It appears he took the dinghy. So did he put Lynette's body in the dinghy and then bring her somewhere? Did he throw her into the ocean? Probably not, because maybe he would assume she'd get washed up. I don't know. Did he bring her to some remote island or remote key or abandoned marina or something and bury her and then, think he was going to move it later or do something later? I don't know. I don't know. I think that's what they're trying to find out. Since the soulmate was seized, federal investigators have launched extensive new targeted searches based entirely on data recovered from electronic devices on the boat. So after receiving explicit permission from authorities in the Bahamas to enter their waters, a specialized U.S. Coast Guard vessel arrived with a full dive team and sonar equipment, and they focused their underwater search on a very precise section of the Sea of Abaco where depths hit 25 feet. So far deeper than the area where Brian and Lynette would be kind of bringing their little dinghy. Now, recent search images released by the Coast Guard show that teams have also deployed specialized cadaver dogs to scan specific land and shoreline areas in the Bahamas, signaling that investigators are looking for remains both underwater and on nearby terrain. So like I said, did Brian put her in the water? Did he put her on land? They're looking at both possibilities. Clearly, I am not the only person who doesn't believe Brian Hooker. The authorities are now using actual evidence instead of fabricated Brian Hooker fake evidence to search for Lynette. Unfortunately, with how much time has passed and the area where Lynette went missing, the odds of finding her at this point would be exceptionally low. The region consists of hundreds of isolated keys, massive barrier reefs, hidden mangrove swamps. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's not the place you want to go missing. It's not the place you want to go with your husband if, you know, you're having an argument and he's mad at you and you think he might want to dispose of your body. If a body is caught in deep underwater caverns or dense tidal mangroves, physical searches are going to be incredibly difficult, even with drones, even with cadaver dogs. Additionally, the Sea of Abaco connects to the deep open Atlantic Ocean through narrow, high-velocity tidal cuts, not to mention that the warm waters of the Bahamas hold large populations of apex predators like tiger sharks and bull sharks. Tragically, in warm tropical waters, marine scavenging can erase physical evidence within days, but there is a small slice of hope, all right? Because even if recovery of Lynette's full remains doesn't happen now and isn't going to be possible, remains in tropical climates are known to frequently wash ashore years later on remote, uninhabited keys, and skeletal remains can survive indefinitely, underwater or on land. So there would be a chance of her skeleton or a portion of her skeleton washing up and DNA testing being able to be done on that. But how long will that take? How long would it take for someone to stumble upon skeletal remains if they wash up somewhere very remote, somewhere not often visited? How long will Brian Hooker continue to get away with this? Because I think he's getting away with it. Okay, I know he has not been charged. I understand. But allegedly, in my opinion, based on a lot, Brian Hooker knows exactly what happened to Lynette. And he's never going to tell us. And by the way, at this time, like I said, I want to remind you, Brian Hooker's exact current location is unknown. And sources close to Brian recently told media outlets that due to his extensive maritime expertise, they worry he may have fled the United States by land or by water by now. Crossed the border. He's just gone. So, people who are like kind of familiar with the federal side of investigations are like, no, the feds know where he is. They have an eye on him. They're just waiting for him to make a move. They know where he is. Was Brian's mother really sick? Once again, how much more suspicious could you get? How much more suspicious could you get? So that's where we are. There's a lot to talk about this case. I might actually go live and talk about it because there's other little things that I kind of want to like float by you, but that's the main stuff that we have right now. Let me know what you think about this. Are you also finding it hard to believe that Brian Hooker is telling the truth? Or are you kind of like, leave Brian alone? He's really upset. He's so upset he left the Bahamas the day after he said he would never stop searching for his wife. Leave Brian alone. Let me know what you think about this. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. I really want to chat with you guys in the comments about this case. I can't wait to discuss it. This has been on my mind for quite some time, for months. And I would really like to see this man get some comeuppance. I'd really like to see him face the music. So let me know what you think in the comments. I'll talk to you there. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. And I'll see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep. The mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name. Better say I Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.